Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Emily Sigelski, the editorial director here at Worth, and I'm thrilled you could join us for this session on Urb-Innovation: Can Cities Rise to the Challenge? This afternoon, I am joined by a very special guest, Josh Syrifman, Senior Advisor and co-founder of Sidewalk Labs. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Everyone is muted on entry, but this is meant to be a conversation. So we encourage you to ask questions either through the Q&A function or the chat box, and we will incorporate them into our discussion as we go. So let's dive right in. Flight from American downtowns has more than doubled since the onset of the pandemic. While crime, homelessness, and environmentalism constitute several reasons for this trend, the story is more complex. Moving forward, how we work, play, produce, and exchange ideas will reflect this disjuncture caused by COVID. Cities that embrace innovation and change will thrive, while those that ignore this inflection point and simply return to normal will see destructive trends continue. Given the current anti-urban movement, how can we leverage COVID's lessons to create new opportunities and jumpstart a more sustainable and equitable urban future? The projected global revenue for smart city technologies, products, and services is forecast to reach $129 billion this year, with smart city markets set to reach $670 billion by 2030. So, where are the critical pockets for new investment and partnerships in this post pandemic moment? Luckily, I'm joined by an expert today. Josh Syrifman co-founded and served as president of Sidewalk Labs, the leading urban innovation company and key investment area for Alphabet, and remains active as co-founder and senior advisor for the company. Josh has helped build and guide the growth of a groundbreaking company, bridging technology and urbanism to radically improve quality of life in cities, and also led the closely followed effort by Sidewalk Labs to transform Toronto's waterfront into a new model for technology-enabled, sustainable, and affordable development. So I'd love to start with a personal check-in. How are you doing, Josh?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, most people know of your remarkable work at Sidewalk Labs, but I think it's important to highlight just how broad your career has been. Throughout your time at the helm of your company, Syrefman Ventures, as Senior Vice President of U.S. Development for Brookfield Properties, and in your many high level roles within the administration of Mayor Michael Bloomberg, you've brokered transformational partnerships, both public and private, that have led to groundbreaking, sustainable, and equitable development projects. These experiences put you in a unique position to analyze the many changes our US cities are undergoing. So clearly, the trends we see in cities have shifted since 2015 when you started Sidewalk Labs. I'm curious, when you met with Larry Page, then CEO of Alphabet, what was your proposal and his challenge to you?
Uh, Thanks, Emily, for the introduction. Also, your description of my career starts to make me feel very old. Um, uh, so Larry Page reached out to us, my colleague Dan Doctoroff, and we started a dialogue with a whole team of folks at then Google. Alphabet had not yet been formed, and
Mm,
it's sort of amazing. They had been doing a lot of thinking about cities, and in the ways that, in some ways you'd expect at a tech company. And there were lots of ideas. Should we build a city? Should it be on an island in the middle of the ocean
mm,
without a government? Because then we can see anything that's possible. And really. What emerged from that was a really rich dialogue around the challenges facing cities, and
mm,
COVID notwithstanding, and we'll get to that. Urbanism is a massive trend over a long period of time that's happening around the world. It's only more important, I think, as we face extraordinary challenges due to changes in climate change, and sustainability requirements that to ensure our future. And they got that. And what was fascinating is the tech mentality is so different than the traditional urbanist mentality. And so, to be perfectly honest, for a while it was a little bit of a collision of cultures and
really?
of ways of thinking. And you think about city shaping and city changing, and it takes time. Things don't happen overnight. And you think about innovation and progression and change in the tech environment, and it's almost instantaneous. And so we had challenges over time. We had challenge of scale. You know, if you think about the transformation of a neighborhood, a district, in a city, you know, maybe 100,000 people are immediately affected. You think about tech innovation, and you're scaling to billions of people. And so, you know, our very early days were a really fascinating mix of different perspectives and cultures. And from that grew a very strong belief shared by everybody that there's so much capability and technology that was not being harnessed for how we think about developing our cities, managing our cities, shaping cities, taking on the challenges facing
Mhm.
cities.
So, how did you approach developing a business model around this mission?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, it really it evolved, as I think anybody who's created a startup can identify with. You go through multiple iterations, even a startup in the under the umbrella of such an established entity as Google and Alphabet. What we did in the beginning was we focused very much on a vision that we sort of took down to a district scale, and we said, okay, let's just sort of take an incremental step here and think about if you could imagine what's possible at a district scale. Think of sort of large neighborhood, and if you could use all the capabilities of technology in ways to shape how that district takes place and is created and developed and operated, what might be possible. And from that vision, many things emerge. The central concept of creating a place, which had, you know, enormous value to us over time in multiple ways. The insights across all of the layers. If you think about place, and there's so many layers. There's people and all of the social dimensions. There's infrastructure. There's the built environment. There's the public realm. There's a digital layer, and those insights over time have led to, in some cases, companies that have been created and have been spun off as successful businesses, um, platforms that have been created, where also we've turned businesses into, so for in the case of, for example, sidewalk infrastructure partners, essentially a platform for across multiple sectors. And in other cases, it's provide the unifying glue across the business model. So, you know, for us, we realized you had to think about it as an ecosystem of elements. And that ecosystem included those insights that lead you down the path to perhaps products,
Mhm.
includes capital that allows you to sort of take the time and have the patience to sort of take the long view on things. Um, and that you want all these things to be connected by a shared vision across the pieces. Interestingly, over time, the company has continues to evolve and has become more and more focused on individual products within that sort of broader ecosystem.
Well, yes, the company has changed a bit since those early days, and I want to fast forward to 2021 now. Clearly, a lot has changed, not just for Google and Alphabet, but for the entire world. And a lot of news outlets are speculating on the future of cities after seeing how the pandemic has affected them. What do you think still resonates today from the original Sidewalk Labs business model post COVID, and what has changed?
You know, I think COVID, which by the way, I think it'll be, we won't know for years all the impacts on cities from COVID. It'll be fascinating to see. But I think COVID, in many ways, it's been an accelerant in some cases or an illuminator in other cases. You know, so many things it's shed light on that were really not because of COVID, but were already happening in our cities, and you know, lots of stuff that needs fixing. I think in many ways, what Sidewalk Labs is trying to do is only more important now, post, and let's hope it's post COVID, than even before. And I think we had a strong focus on achieving outcomes like affordability, sustainability in the urban environment. Those are even more paramount now,
Hmm.
when you factor in the impacts of COVID, when you factor in all of the social challenges that have only been amplified by COVID. So, you know, as a business model, I think in some ways it has accelerated an understanding of the need for those things. There's also an interesting dimension to it, which I think time will tell if this holds to be true. When we tried to create, you mentioned before, our attempt to create a place in Toronto on the waterfront that would sort of bring all these pieces together. That process of trying to make that happen was, an extraordinary experience that I think in many ways created value in multiple ways for us, for the people involved, for Toronto, for I think in some ways on a global scale, because we were a little bit ahead of our time. And
Mm,
one very interesting potential impact from COVID, remains to be seen, but is the ability for stakeholders all around an issue to understand that technology is a tool that can help and to be used and deployed. And it's not technology for technology itself is in my view never an answer,
mm.
but it allows so many things to be possible that might not have been before. And we just lived through, and we're still all, we're doing this remotely. We're all still living through a moment where technology and its presence in our day to day lives took an enormous step forward. And so, to be seen, but I think that impact could be very, very interesting.
Well, and just like technology, I think data is plays both a critical role in everything going on right now, and it's something that's controversial in terms of how much personal privacy do we have. And I would imagine that data is very important in the tech that you're deploying in Toronto or wherever, and using that data to evaluate how you move forward. Is that correct?
Yeah, although it's a very misunderstood subject.
Hmm.
In some cases, for example, we spun out a company called Replica, which provides really amazing analytic insights based on a whole series of data sources. And so you can look at and understand how people are truly moving around in a city, or where dollars are being spent, literally down to at the block level. And really powerful information that policymakers, community organizations, businesses, whoever it is, can use for a whole array of purposes. It's anonymized data, so it's got fairly rigorous privacy practices on it. I think increasingly the data question is it's a good example of where I think the world is sort of catching up, where and maybe that's where COVID has accelerated things. In Toronto, I think there were a confluence of things that sort of made data a hot button issue, not often, in my view, really understood by people. Also, there was an impression that we were proposing much more personal data and user data than had ever been part of what we were envisioning. I will say, I do think that the public sector is starting to wake up, but I do think the public sector needs to lead the way on on the guidelines for the capture of data. The reality is so much data already gets captured and used, and people don't really know. There's sort of made an implicit value proposition in doing things using an app that gives them something that they need, and that data is getting sold. That was never part of the business model for us. It still is not. I can't imagine it ever will be. But data as a tool is so available now and so readily usable, and it can be so powerful for anything. For particularly, we're talking about cities, enormously helpful in understanding what's really happening.
So, what role does data play in the future of a smart city exactly?
It's interesting. Smart city is an expression I'm not a fan of. I think
What do you prefer?
Well, I think there was a time when the notion of being able to capture data or to use technology sort of made a city smart, and there were a bunch of products to support that. I actually think this day and age, it's an inherent part of the design of whatever it is, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's buildings, whether it's and the information that you can get about the performance, whether that's emissions to sort of understand carbon footprint, whether that's to sort of monitor for maintenance purposes, whatever it is. Increasingly, I think those capabilities are more and more becoming a normal part of the design of whatever elements of city. And so I think in some ways we've left the smart city concept behind already. It's just cities, and it's just a
Yeah.
set of tools that we have
Mhm.
is ever expanding.
That makes sense. Now, there's this idea of a 15-minute city, which has been being talked about by the mayor of Paris. And it's gotten a lot of coverage over the past few months, trying to believe it basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea is that everything should be reachable by foot or public transportation within 15 minutes within a city. What do you think about this idea? Is it a winner? I'd love to hear your opinions here.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great idea in many ways. I think what's underpinning it is a very important theme that, as you think about cities more expansively, of decentralization and dispersion. And one of the things that we've learned from COVID is how to, we learned many things about balancing between work and non-work activities, between what the workplace can be or should be, what the city can be or should be. So I think as a concept, I think it's a very powerful one. And I think it's where it's been done well. I think it's worked really wonderfully. I will say, however, though, that it's traditionally sort of talked about as the 15-minute city where you have beautiful parks and this or that all and thing. I think one of the things we have to be very mindful of is there are many stretches, neighborhoods in all of our cities that where communities don't have the basic resources. And I think there's the 15-minute city as a concept tends to be the sort of much more based on a much more sort of affluent definition of the city. We have to really look at where there's healthcare, where there's food resources, jobs, sort of all of the fundamentals that actually everyone should have access to within their neighborhood. And so I think as a movement, the 15-minute city could stand for a broader definition and view on things.
When you think about this 15-minute city idea and maybe other ideas or theories or plans that are similar, how do you see these ideas addressing these like underserved communities? How do we go about, making sure that they are incorporated in this next iteration of urban planning that's taking place?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's. I wish that I had a simple sort of off the shelf answer, but I think it starts with first and foremost, to use a little bit of a cliche, intentionality, and I'll give you a sort of very simple example. You think about all of the movements that put highway building ahead of community building in the past, in the 60s and 70s and 50s. I'm involved in a project in Minneapolis where what's there now is radically different from what was there for decades. We had sort of vibrant black neighborhoods that literally three highways just sort of were, the neighborhoods were completely dismantled for the highways. When I say intentionality, I mean you have to say that the impacts of equity are going to be the top priority, and your policy decisions, your financial decisions, your approach has to at every step of the way be driven by that, and that's not easy to do, and that requires a real change in mindset. I think on the public sector side, I think honestly the private sector needs to catch up. I think financing tools have to catch up and be available for this. I think the definition of how ownership and equity can be distributed is an enormous area of growth where we can find new tools. I think affordability, where it's not just about sort of building affordable housing, but literally sort of disrupting what it costs to build housing and structurally lowering the price. And so, anyway, I think it starts though with very, very committed intentionality across every part of the ecosystem.
That makes sense. We have a question in from Justin Douglas. Justin, thanks for joining us. Justin mentions that whenever he's in a city located in hot climates, there is one thing he notices: tree-lined streets are much more comfortable. We know that this kind of urban greening helps bring down air temperature and improves air quality. Can you see a data-driven or other opportunities to drive an acceleration in deploying this simple natural capital solution to providing a better city living environment? Thank you for the question, Justin. I think it's a great one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great question. Yes, you can already see where heat mapping, for example, can be the basis for the distribution and planting of new trees. And you see this happening in cities. Interestingly, you're starting to see several cities have, they have different titles, but chief heat officer type roles, and where the job is to literally figure out strategies to address temperature. And you will find in many cities neighborhoods that have been underinvested, underrepresented, have an enormous disparity in the amount of street trees. It's a very simple and great way to do things. I'm on the board of an organization in New York, the New York Restoration Project, that in partnership with the Bloomberg Foundation and others, had a million tree project that was intended to supplant and succeeded in planting a million trees in neighborhoods throughout the city. It's a great way, and data can very fast now tell you exactly where it's most needed.
That's amazing. And I think that kind of leads us into this next part of our conversation. I think everyone probably on this call has read analysis of the IPCC climate report. It's pretty sobering. How do you see the role of transsectoral development partnerships in addressing our larger existential threats, such as the ones outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals?
I am a big believer that we have to. The only path to meaningful solutions is cross sectoral. That I think government on its own can't do things. I think the business world has to play an enormous role. I think pulling together with academia, business, not for profits, community, affected communities, philanthropy, capital, you name it, I think is the only path. And I know it's sort of big words, but I really actually truly believe that. I don't think that solutions will emerge at scale without that kind of alignment and breaking down of boundaries.
Are there any cities currently that can be held up as examples of either countries doing or cities doing it well or poorly?
Um, I mean, listen, sadly, I think many are doing it poorly. Having said that, I think cities, particularly in this country, have been leading the way on sustainability. I think you find elements in many cities. Honestly, I think New York's done a ton of great things. I think Paris has done some really interesting things. Singapore has done really interesting things. There's examples from all over. I have yet to find the sort of the one place that is the sort of shining example of all things perfection on this. I think everybody's sort of striving towards that.
That makes sense. We spoke a little bit about this earlier about poor neighborhoods and serving these underserved communities. But something we did not touch on is gentrification. And I am curious how how do we fuel investment and create jobs in these communities without triggering the harmful effects of gentrification? Um, I'm in New York as well, and I've seen this all throughout different parts of the city, especially in Brooklyn. You can literally wake up one day, a regular neighborhood, and you go back a month later, and it's completely changed, and not necessarily for the better. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, right. Gentrification is a complicated one. I
Mhm.
think I think partially it's on what's prioritized in planning from at a city level and at a neighborhood level, and so I think that's very much on cities and how they're managed by their governments,
Mhm.
because you have to you, the market, at least in the U.S. market, left to its own devices, will only foster the forces that create gentrification, and so you have to, one path is to counter that or change the rules of the game. I think there's also an interesting possibility where, um, if you start changing the tools that we have, that's where we were talking briefly before about ownership models,
Mhm.
and intentionality. If you could change the economics of what it means to build, um, you could you could include existing residents in different ways in ownership models or in equity models. Not easy. It's not easy, and
Mhm.
I don't think anybody has truly on a large scale sort of cracked the code on this. But I think you have to change the rules, otherwise it will just repeat itself.
We have another question in from Jody Westby. Thank you, Jody. Another great question. What about the movement from urban areas to more rural locations for remote workers? Some smaller places are offering incentives to people to move there for remote work. Will this movement have much of an impact on urban locations?
I am of the school of thought that I don't believe COVID is the sort of death knell for cities as we know them.
Hmm.
I think that the draw of large cities will continue to be a thing. I do think that I also, by the way, think that over time we will move more and more. Not, I don't think we'll ever return to that sort of pure definition of the office and the home, or the workplace and the home, um, but that we will find our equilibrium on sort of what's that hybrid model. But it will nevertheless sort of still have that notion of some degree of centrality. Having said that, there's an extraordinary moment in time for smaller cities, for smaller towns. I don't personally think that things like, I think there will be examples where small rural towns can have a little bit of revitalization. I don't think it's going to be a sort of massive movement. I think it'll happen in pockets, and I don't think it will cost urban locations. I think some balance would be a healthy thing for both sides of that equation.
That makes sense. Um, Given where we are right now coming out of this pandemic, what are you seeing are opportunities for future investment in urban innovation, and where should people be investing, and what areas should they be looking towards next, I guess.
A little scary to give investment advice. I will say I think that urban innovation as a thing has grown enormously. When we started Sidewalk, the term urban innovation, people were like, "What the hell are you talking about?" Um,
Hmm.
and I think this sort of understanding of the blending of the physical and digital is becoming more and more accepted, and if not quite second nature yet, much closer to it. So I think there's so many ideas out there and so many things happening. It's a hard space to make sense of. I think that increasingly people will have to respond to sustainability needs. And I think government regulation will increasingly drive that. And so, I'm particularly attracted to that space where people are really thinking about um, new models there, and are stretching now for what would be, difficult to make work operationally now, but in time will have to be the standard. I love things like that. I love things where in the built environment, where we start looking at how do you structurally change costs,
Hmm.
materiality. I love stuff like that. There's so many different areas. I love the idea of how do you give flexibility to how people use their physical space, how they use cities, and what does that mean for lots of dynamic, whether it's dynamic curb management, whatever it is, dynamic leasing models. There's so many things in that space too. We could go on for a long time about different possibilities. I don't feel like I know enough about it, but I'm very interested in different financing tools. I think that they
Hmm.
have enormous potential. I think the impact investing field has not really sort of emerged yet as a true force, and I think that that's a very interesting space personally.
I agree with you. I think it's fascinating, and it's only now just like blossoming, and it's only going to continue to do so, in my opinion. Um, we have a question from Allison Gross, and a follow-up question. Are you working on looking at the reuse for the potential mass of empty office buildings in city centers? Because this will need rezoning and cooperation of commercial building landlords. Another great question, Allison. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I personally am not doing any of that right now, but I know a lot of people are on the real
Mhm.
estate side of things, on the public sector side of things. On how can you do residential conversions? Are there other use changes? I think it's a little early to know where the downtown office market, where whatever market we're in, starts to stabilize.
Mhm.
But I think in any case, some amount of inventory is going to have to be rethought. And I think there's actually very interesting examples of everything from parking garages to all kinds of office buildings, which can be tough because sometimes their interiors are deep, but on conversions on them.
What's your and another question from the audience? Thanks, guys. I appreciate you guys' engagement. Andy Jones asks, "What is your take on Copenhagen's ambition to be carbon neutral by 2025, and what are the tech implications?"
Um, I think if anybody can achieve it, Copenhagen's probably in by far the best position. Um, I don't know enough about where they are in it, but I know a fair amount about things they're doing. There's enormous tech implications. I mean, it's sort of inherent in many aspects of the approach, whether on the infrastructure side, on the building performance and operation side. So there's all kinds of implications there. Um, there's also lots of very interesting emerging ideas. I don't know if they're doing there, but for example, if you think about virtual energy grids and where what you're really doing is connecting consumers through their, to just all you need is their smart thermostat, and you can start managing demand in a very different way. Anyways, there's a million different ideas coming out of stuff people are doing, and Copenhagen is a great spot actually. And to your question before, I would have put it on my list. I should have.
Um, So what this is leads me to kind of some of our we're getting close to time, not there yet. So a real big question, nothing real small. What do you think the future of cities will look like in the next 5, 10, 15 years down the line? A real easy softball question for you.
That's uh, I think urbanization will increase. I think a huge variable that I'm not smart enough to know the impact of is um, global warming, and will we start to see migration patterns from cities in southern regions to northern regions because of that? I don't know, but that's interesting to think about. I think cities will start to get increasingly um, rigid in their regulatory regimes, which I think is the right thing to do, and I think we'll start seeing cities becoming healthier. Um, and beyond that, I think that the cities will play this ultimately the most critical role in getting to a much more sustainable development patterns. I don't think we have a choice, to be perfectly honest. I think that's going to 5, 10 years. We're going to, but
That's
20 years. But either we won't be here or we do things like that. So
Yeah, absolutely. Finally, on a more personal note, you stepped down as president of Sidewalk Labs about 1 year ago. Is that right?
yes.
And you're now serving as senior. Okay, you're now serving as senior advisor. Are you pursuing any new projects that you can tell us about?
I am pursuing one thing of relevance. It's it's what I would call a not-for-profit startup. There's a very wonderful place in New York called Governor's Island, and it's a beautiful island about 800 feet off of Lower Manhattan, about 400 feet off of Brooklyn. Um, when I was in City Hall in the Bloomberg years, I did the deal with the federal government for the, at the time, state and city to acquire it. Now it's just the city. The entity that runs it is seeking to catalyze the creation of a center for climate solutions on the island. And so I've been working with a consortium of organizations to think about, how do you take advantage of it? It's an extraordinary location. How can you create a global center point of, to your earlier question, cross-sectoral collaboration um, on Governor's Island, where, in New York we have the harbor, and we are, an archetype of a waterfront city facing sea level rise. We have the UN. We have the, we're still the capital of finance and media.
Mhm.
How do you leverage all these assets to sort of pull together extraordinary things to happen there? And so I'm involved in that. Um, uh,
Exciting.
is not a commercial venture, but and then I'm dabbling a bunch of other stuff, and thinking about where I want to spend the bulk of my time moving forward.
That sounds great. When you say the bulk of your time moving forward, are you talking about moving? Like,
No, 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 no. Just
oh, okay.
where I want my professional energies to be spent.
Gotcha. I was like, if there's a city that you are planning to move to, I think that's
Yeah.
where you might want to go, everyone. Well, I want to thank you so much, Josh. This has been an incredible conversation. We are so fortunate to get to spend some time with you this afternoon and pick your brain. Thank you to everyone who has joined, all the attendees. We really appreciate you all supporting Worth. Join us next month, where Worth will be hosting a panel on how to harness the power of a diverse and inclusive workplace, featuring Nora Ali, a former anchor at Cheddar, and Marcus Glover, co-founder and managing director at Lockstep Ventures. And we will also be hosting our Women in Worth Summit next month, Wednesday, September 29th. The theme is Reset, Refresh, Rebuild. You can register for both of those events and more on worth.com/events. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you guys at some of those in the future. And thanks again to Josh and everyone who attended. Really, really appreciate it, guys. Have a great rest of your day.